the image below each paragraph element. I'm going to type img to get the image self-closing tag. For the source, I'm now going to go reference the images I have in my project. And if you remember, we're going to be using a relative URL to achieve that. The images I need are inside this images subfolder. So I'm first going to type images to grab the folder, and then straight away VS Code shows me what's inside that folder. So I'm just going to click Features 1. I'm going to add the alt text of Simple Online Journaling. Let's go grab the second feature image. I'm going to type img to get the image tag. For the source, it's the same thing. I go images / and now get feature 2. For the alt text, I'm going to write beautifully displayed journals. And for the final feature, I'm going to pop below this paragraph element here, type img and hit enter. For the source, again, it's the same thing. Images / and then I'll click features 3. For the alt text, I'm going to put create journals anywhere. So let's go check this out in the browser. So you can see that the images are now appearing nicely below each paragraph for each feature. Now, one thing you'll notice is that these images are huge. HTML will always display the image as its original file size. Inside the images folder, I'm going to right-click on an image and go Get Info. You can see that the dimension of this image is 117 by 904, which is quite large. Image sizing is something we handle properly in CSS, but for now I do want to make this image a bit smaller so that it's easier to work in this HTML file. To do that, inside the image tag, I'm going to go add another attribute called width and hit enter. I'm then going to enter a value of 300 pixels. I'm going to hit save and then refresh the browser. You can see the image has now shrunk to 300 pixels. When I use just the width property, the height automatically scales to maintain something called the aspect ratio. If I did specify a height, say 100 pixels, you'll see the image becomes distorted. Instead of setting a width, I could have just set a height, let's say 400 pixels. And in this case, the width is automatically calculated to ensure the aspect ratio remains the same. Now, in all honesty, don't worry about any of this. We're going to be deleting it anyway when we get to CSS. But for now, I do just want to make these images a bit smaller so that the images don't appear massive when we're inspecting the HTML document in the browser. I'm going to add back the width of 300 pixels. And I'm going to copy and paste this into the other images. So now we end up with more reasonably sized images. Again, don't worry about any of this. Aspect ratio, pixels, we're going to be covering all this in CSS. For now, you can literally just copy width equals 300 pixels to resize the images and forget about it. Finally, we'll dive into scalar vector graphics and how to implement them using SVGs. We'll be looking at comparing bitmap and vector images, the SVG tag, and how to use SVGs. To understand SVGs, we need to take a step back and look at the different types of image formats. Most images you look at in day-to-day life, like photographs, are bitmap images, also known as raster images. They are made from a grid of pixels, with each pixel assigned a color value. Here's a TikTok video showing this in quite a neat way. Here's a photograph of a person, and the person in this video is recreating this image inside Excel by assigning each grid a different color value. Many hours later, they've built 2 rows, and 3,000 years later, they've got a few more rows. And after around 240,000 cells, they've recreated the original photograph inside Microsoft Excel. Bitmap images are resolution dependent. This means that the quality and clarity of the image are directly tied to the pixel dimensions. So enlarging the image beyond its original size can lead to a loss of sharpness and detail, which we call pixelation. Bitmap images are typically used for photographs and images that require a lot of detail. And typical file formats for bitmap images include JPEG and PNG. So let's take a look at some examples of bitmap images. On the Notion page, real-life imagery, which are photographs, will be bitmap images. So this photo of the community meetup and profile pictures of people in the testimonials will be real-life imagery. I now want to show you the pixelation issue I was talking about earlier. If I go to this photo over here and click right-click, copy image address, and paste it in another tab, I'll be taken to the source file of that image. And as you can see, this is the original size of that image. If I now zoom in on this image, you'll see that as it gets larger, it becomes very pixelated. It's losing quality. And that's because bitmap images are resolution dependent. Enlarging the image beyond its original size will lead to a loss of sharpness and detail. Now, the other image type is called a vector image. These images are made by mathematical equations and instructions for rendering shapes, paths, and colors. They are resolution independent, meaning that if the image is enlarged, it won't lose quality because it is being described mathematically as opposed with a fixed number of pixels. Vectors are commonly used for smaller images, like logos and icons. And common formats for vector images are SVG, which stands for Scalable Vector Graphics, and AI, which stands for Adobe Illustrator, which is a type of vector graphic file created in Adobe Illustrator, a popular vector graphics editing program. So let's now take a look at some vector images. Back on the Notion homepage, I'm now in the footer. The Notion logo over here is a vector graphic. And these social media icons are also vector graphics. Now, most of the time, the vector graphics we're going to be working with are SVGs. And both the logo and social icons here are SVGs. So let's take a look at the SVG tag. An SVG has two components to it. The first component is the SVG tags themselves, which has an opening and closing tag. The SVG tags have several attributes, which determine styling rules, such as the fill, which sets the background color, stroke, which sets the color of the lines and shapes drawn, and stroke width, which sets the thickness of the lines. The second component of an SVG is the path self-closing tag. The path tag has an attribute that plots the shapes and line paths of the SVG. It gives the image its form. Now, these attributes may seem very overwhelming. The good news is that you're never going to code your own SVGs. You'll be grabbing the SVG code from other places. For example, the social media icons we're going to be using in the Quill application is from this resource called Ion Icons. We just search for the icon we want, say Facebook. You then just click on the icon and you can download the SVG here. As you can see, there is an array of icons you can choose from. Don't worry too much about the specifics of the SVG code. You just need to know the basics of what makes an SVG, where the attributes inside the SVG tag are styling rules, and the attribute inside the path tag defines its shape. You're either going to grab SVG somewhere online or they're going to be provided to you by someone like a designer. Now, an important idea we need to discuss is how you actually go about using SVGs in your code. You have two options. The first is called inline. This means the SVG code is used directly inside your HTML code. So you would place your SVG, say in your index.html document, exactly like this. Let's go to VS Code and see how this works. The first thing I'm going to do is download a sample SVG we're going to use. Let's grab this plain one. I'm going to click Download SVG, and this will go to my Downloads folder. Now that I've downloaded the file, I'm going to go and make a new folder on my desktop called SVG. I'm now going to move the SVG I just downloaded into this folder. And I'm going to open this folder just to double check it's there. Great, our SVG is in this folder. I'm now going to open up this folder in VS Code. So I'm going to go Open, go on the desktop, click the SVG folder, and click Open. If I double click the SVG, you can see here is the SVG code. I'm going to come in this folder and create a new HTML document. I'm going to right click, making sure I'm inside this folder, click New File, and let's call this svg.html. I'll grab my boilerplate code straight away by hitting !Enter. And let's title this document SVG. And I'm going to hit save. Now to place the SVG in line, all you would do is copy the SVG code and pop it inside the body. I'm also just going to give this an H1 of plain. So let's check this out in the browser. So you can see that our SVG is rendering inside the browser, and it's been placed directly inside the HTML document. In fact, this SVG over here is actually doing nothing. If I deleted it, there'd be no impact. Let me refresh the browser, and you'll see nothing has changed because the SVG has been placed directly inside the HTML document. I have restored the SVG because we will need it in a bit, but I just wanted to show you that because the SVG is placed inline here, this has no impact. The other option is to use an image element and reference the SVG, exactly how we do with bitmap images. We would use an image tag like this on index.html and use the source attribute to reference a relative URL where the SVG is stored. In this case, logo.svg, which is inside the images directory. So let's look at this option inside VS Code. Back to our previous example, I'm now going to remove this SVG, which we did inline, and instead I'm going to go grab the image tag by typing img and hitting enter. Now for the source, I'm going to go reference our SVG, which is sitting in the exact same directory as our HTML file. So all I need to do is type airplane, and it will locate our SVG, and I'll hit enter. For the alternative text, I'm just going to write airplane. Let's check this out in the browser. So you can see we end up with the same result. Our airplane is rendering in the browser, but this time it's not inline, it's with an image tag that is referencing this SVG here. It means that the existence of this SVG is important. If I were to delete this, the source attribute in the image tag would be referencing nothing. Let me show you that. I'm going to delete this, and I'll refresh the browser, and you'll see the SVG disappears. All we're left with is a broken image icon and the alt text. Now, before I go on and say which option is better, I want to quickly talk about the reason we even have these options, whereas we didn't have this option where it came to a bitmap image used in the previous video. This is because a bitmap image is what is called embedded into the HTML. We always have to reference either an absolute or relative URL for a bitmap image, whereas a vector graphic can be directly integrated into the HTML document using the SVG tags. It's kind of like the vector image is made inside the HTML, whereas the bitmap image lives outside the HTML. So we could never place the bitmap image directly inline the document. We always have to reference it with the image tags. So which option should you use? My preferred option is this one on the right, using the image element. And there are two reasons for this. The first is that we have something called separation of concerns. This is a term you'll hear a lot in software engineering. It is a design principle in which programs are organized into distinct sections, each addressing a specific aspect of functionality. In simple words, we want to separate our SVGs from our structural HTML. This helps with keeping our code well organized and easier to maintain. The second reason is performance. The browser can store these images for quick retrieval, reducing the amount of data that needs to be loaded each time and speeding up the page loading times. Another side benefit is that more complicated SVGs can get very long, so it is nice not to have them clutter our main HTML documents. In this course, we'll be using the second method, but be aware the first method can also work. So let's finish off the summary card for this topic. Self-closing tags and images. We looked at SVGs. We saw an SVG has two components. The SVG tags, which have attributes defining the styling rules, and the path self-closing tag that defines the shapes and form of the SVG. We also saw the best practice of using an SVG through the image tag, where the SVG is referenced as the source attribute. This means we have the SVG located somewhere like inside an images directory, and this SVG would be referenced inside the main HTML document, like index.html. So let's go and add SVGs to our Quill homepage. We have an SVG logo in the top left corner here, and at the bottom of the page, we have that same logo, as well as SVG social media icons at the bottom here. So let's jump into VS Code and code this up. So first up, let's go grab all the social media icons from Ionic Ions. I'll grab the Facebook one first. I click Download SVG. Now you can go ahead and download them all yourself, but I've put a download link to each of them in the description below. Now for the Quill logo, this is a bit more of a custom SVG. It's not from an icon website like Ionic Icons. I actually made this myself inside Figma, which we will be covering later on in the bootcamp. You can download the Quill SVG in the description below, and this would be a similar experience for more custom SVGs, where a designer would likely provide you with the file. Once everything is downloaded, you'll have 5 social media SVGs and the 1 Quill logo SVG. Let's move all of these into the images folder inside Quill. So let's jump back into VS Code where we've been working on our Quill project. Let's first add the Quill logo in the navigation. We're basically going to do what this comment says. So let's remove it and add in the logo. We're going to grab an image tag, so I'm going to type img and hit enter. Inside the source attribute, I now need to reference the logo SVG. We know that's inside the images folder, so I'm going to type images /, and it's the quill.svg file. I'm going to give it an alt text of Quill logo. Let's check that renders in the browser. So there it is, we can see the SVG has rendered in the browser. Now, what we want to do is make this SVG clickable. Because this navigation bar is going to be on most pages throughout the application, we want the functionality to be that when you click the logo, you're always taken back to the home page. That's how it's done on most web applications. So now what we're going to do is going to seem a bit tricky, but we're actually going to wrap our image tag with anchor tags. So the first thing I'm going to do is just cut this image. I'm going to now grab our anchor tags by hitting enter. The href attribute is just the index page. It's where we want to be navigated back to when we click the SVG. Now, ordinarily inside the anchor tags we put text, like login and register, but I'm just going to paste in the SVG I just cut. So what this has done has made the image clickable. If I refresh the browser, you'll see that the cursor changes, and that I can click this. I'm just taken back to the original page, so you can't really see much of an effect. But this image is now clickable. It's a hyperlink. This may seem a bit tricky, but just think about it. Instead of having text here, like get started, I'm just putting an image. So the image is acting like the clickable text. Let's go and do this exact same thing at the bottom of the page. I'm simply going to copy this, delete this, and paste in what I copied. It's what we had on the design, just the Quill logo again, and we've made it clickable to take you back to the home page. And here it is. Now, it might look a bit weird why the Quill logo is appearing next to the Get Started as opposed to below. What's going on there? Don't worry about this behavior for now. It is something we will talk about later on in the course. Let's go and sort out our social media icons. Instead of this placeholder text being clickable, we want our SVG clickable. So all I'm going to do is delete the text here and grab an image tag. I'm going to go find the SVG for Instagram. We know that's in the images folder, so I type images / and click instagram.svg. I'll give this an alt text of Instagram logo. Let's refresh the browser. So you can see that the Instagram logo appears, and it's also clickable. And when I click it, I'm taken to the Instagram homepage. Now this one looks even more tricky. We have the image tag wrapped by anchor tags, which is then wrapped by list tags. This kind of wrapping is quite common, so it is something you will get more used to. But it can seem quite tricky to start. You can kind of think of it like this. Usually in a list, we'd have some text. But in this case, instead of text, we're just putting an image. I'm now going to go do the same thing for each social media icon. Grab an image tag, get the source of the image, and give it an alt text. To avoid boring you, I'm just going to go ahead myself and do them. So you can see now I've added in all the social media SVGs. Opening up the browser, we can see that all the social media SVGs have rendered. Now, because they're in a list structure, we still have this bullet point. and we will take care of that in the CSS course. Now these SVGs are appearing very large, so what I want to do is just temporarily reduce their size. I'm going to do the same thing I did with the images by adding in a width attribute. Now a quick trick I want to show you that I sometimes use is how to get cursors in multiple places at once when typing the same thing. Let me zoom in a bit. On my Mac, I'm going to click the Option key. And I'm now going to click in the same location my cursor currently is, but on the line below, while holding the Option key. And you'll see that a second cursor appears. I'm going to do the same thing on the other three. I believe the shortcut on Windows is Ctrl-Alt. Now what I'm going to do is type space, width, hit enter, and let's make the width 20 pixels. I'm going to save this and then just click away. So of course, you could have written it once and copied and pasted it 4 times, but sometimes this trick can be helpful. I'm going to refresh the browser. So you can see that our social media icons are at a more appropriate size. And as I mentioned in the images chapter, we are going to resize this with CSS, so we will later be removing this width attribute here. I just wanted to do it for now so that our document was a bit more workable. Now, the last thing I want to do before we finish up is add an emoji in our H1. In our design, we have a mobile emoji over here. Now I've left adding the emoji for this chapter because I wanted to show you we can just copy and paste emojis straight from the internet. We don't need to store images separately and reference them, and they're also not complicated SVGs we need to put into our code. So let's go and grab that emoji now. There's a ton of emoji tools out there, but I use this one called React Emojis. They're just a bit more developer friendly. So I'm going to go search mobile. Here are the emojis I want to use. I just click it and it copies it to my clipboard. I'm then just going to paste in the emoji here. Hit save and let's go check this out in the browser. So you can see that our mobile emoji is rendering nicely inside this heading. Another topic done and dusted. It's now time to look at more challenging concepts in the topic HTML forms. This is the bread and butter of web development because almost all web applications need to be able to submit data to a server, which is done through an HTML form. We'll first learn about the different form elements like inputs, text area, and dropdowns, and we'll then take a deep dive into how forms actually submit data to a server. Let's begin by understanding the basic setup and organization of HTML forms, focusing on form structure. We'll be discussing different form elements, form submission, and the form tag. So this topic is getting my more difficult stamp. We're going to be discussing some more complex concepts around web development. So what are forms? Forms collect and submit user-provided data and send it to a web server for processing. An example of a form we all interact with is a registration form. This is the Unsplash registration page. Unsplash is a tool that provides high-quality stock imagery. And over here, you can create a new account. This element is a form. This is the Unsplash homepage where you can search for different images. Although it may not seem like it, a search bar like this is also a form from a web development perspective. The user is submitting data for processing, in this case to find specific results. Now, there are several form elements that make up an HTML form. Forms act as a container for various form elements that allow users to input different types of data. This is a form to contact the sales team at Asana, another project management tool. I'm going to be using this form throughout this topic because it contains all the major types of form elements we will be learning about. At the top of the form, we have inputs. It uses first name, last name, email address, and phone number. Below this, we have a set of drop-downs. The first one is country, where the user can select from a list of predefined countries. And the second one is company size, which has different ranges of numbers, like 1 to 9 and 10 to 99. The next one down is a text area, where the user can put some text about what they would like to discuss. And finally, we have a button, which submits the form. These elements all live inside a form element. Now, before we start looking at coding our own forms in HTML, we first need to get a good understanding of the concept of form submission. Forms need to know where to and how to send data. We're going to understand this concept by looking at interactions we can have with a librarian at a library. The first interaction we're going to look at is borrowing a book from a library. If you wanted to retrieve a specific book from the library, you would go up to the librarian and ask for a book. The librarian would then head over to the shelf where the book would be and would look for the book. If the book is present, the librarian would take the book from the shelf and give it to you. I want to look at two key things in this interaction. The first is what I am asking the librarian to do. In this example, it's retrieve me a book. This is how I'm interacting with the librarian. The second is the location of the book. In this example, it is a history book I'm asking for. This is the where the librarian is going to fulfill my request. I now want to look at a second interaction we could have with the librarian, which is donating a history book. And it would look like this. I would take the book to the librarian and donate it. The librarian would then work out which type of book it is and put it on the correct shelf. Again, there are still two key things that make up this interaction. The first is what I'm asking the librarian to do. In this example, it's take the book I'm donating. This is the how I'm interacting with the librarian. The second is the location of where the book should go. In this example, it is a history book I am donating. This is where the librarian is going to fulfill my request. You may be thinking why I've chosen these two specific cases. Like, donating a book is fairly random compared to just returning a book. I've chosen these two very, very specific real-world examples as they closely relate to two different ways we work with HTML forms, which we will look at now. So let's finally take a look at the form tag. The form element has an opening and closing tag. As we mentioned earlier, these tags act as a container for form elements like inputs, dropdowns, etc., which we will be looking in this topic. For now, I've represented these elements with a comment, which says form elements. Now, the form element has two very important attributes. The first is the action attribute. The action attribute specifies the location on the server where the data will be sent for processing. The location on the server won't mean much to you at this point. All you need to be able to do is conceptually understand what this means, and you already do. It's just the where in the library analogy. Just like in our example before, if the person was borrowing or donating a book, the librarian went to the history shelf. And the same thing's happening here. The location of the server is /API/v1/journals. This is where in our Quill project, our journal entries will be stored. So think of it like a history shelf in the library, or the journal section storage on the database. There could be many other locations on the database for different kinds of data, just like there are different sections of a library. For example, there would be another location where we keep our user data, something like /API/v1/users. Just like there would be another shelf for sciences in a library. Now, I don't love the name action for this attribute. I'd personally call it something like location. But hey, I didn't invent HTML, so what leg can I stand on? The second attribute is the method attribute. This determines the HTTP method used for handling the form data. We will be looking at HTTP methods in a later topic in the Full Stack Bootcamp, so don't worry about the details right now, let's just get a conceptual understanding. Back to our library analogy, this is the how. In one case, the person was borrowing a book, and in the other case, they were donating a book. In the HTML form, we have different HTTP methods, which detail how we are interacting with the server, if we're there to retrieve, submit, update, or delete data. You can see here that this is a post method. This is like us donating the book. We are sending the data to be stored in the server. Other common HTTP methods are get, put, and delete. The get method would be like borrowing a book. Just like we're asking for a specific book, in web development terms, we are asking to get specific data from the server. Now again, at this point, this all may seem a bit overwhelming, but please don't stress about it. We will be discussing HTTP methods in much greater detail in a later topic in the Full Stack Bootcamp. For now, you just need to conceptually understand the idea of what a method is. It simply details how we're interacting with the server, just like how we interact with the librarian. Let's go back to the visuals of the library and add in the HTML attributes as if it was us interacting with the server to get a clearer idea of how this all works. Let's first look at the case of borrowing the book. The how is the method attribute, and it is how we are handling the data. As we are trying to borrow a book, we are getting it, so the method is get. The where is the action attribute and specifies where on the server the data is. As we are borrowing a history book, we are looking in the history section, so the action would be something like /history. Now I know the action previously had something like /API/v1, whereas this one doesn't. Don't worry too much about that. It's web development stuff we'll learn about later. The second case was donating a book. The how is still the method attribute and is again about how we are handling the data. In this case, we are donating the book and not expecting to get anything back. We are posting it, so the value of the method attribute here is post. The where is still the action attribute, and again specifies where on the server the data is. As we are donating a history book, the book is added on the history section. So the value of the action attribute is still /history. Let's go take a look at the form element and its attributes on the Unsplash join page. I'm going to right click and go inspect. I'm then going to click on this inspection tool and click one of the form elements here. Scrolling up, I can see the form element over here. And you can see when I click it, it hovers over the entire form. This is the container element I was talking about earlier that wraps around all the different form elements we'll be looking at soon. What I want to do is look at the attributes. You can see the action attribute over here, which has a / with a string of characters. This is the location on the server where the data will be sent once the form's submitted. We can also see the method attribute here. In this case, it's post, which makes sense. We're going to be sending the data to the server to create a new record. That is, create a new user on the database. It's like donating a book. We're just sending the data. We're not expecting anything back. Let's now go check out the form on the home page. If you remember, this search bar here was also a form. So let's go inspect it. And you can see we have the same form element. The action here is referencing a different location on the server, /s. And the method here is get, not post. In the library analogy, this was like borrowing a book. We're asking the librarian to go get something for us, just like we're asking the server to return specific results for our search query. Now, before we summarize this video, I just wanted to highlight a small thing. Starting your web development career and learning things like DevTools definitely makes you feel a bit like a web warrior. I certainly did. You may go away and start checking out the underlying HTML of different forms across different web pages, and you're quickly going to become confused because you're not going to see the attributes I just spoke about. For example, on this Asana page, if we go inspect and check out the form element, you'll see that the method and action attribute are absent. This is because a front-end framework like React is actually handling the form data. In our Quill project, when we get up to the React section, we'll be doing the exact same thing. This doesn't mean what we've just learned is a waste of time. In fact, if you've come away from this video with a solid conceptual understanding of how forms are submitted, you're doing really well. And it's the same concept when we do get up to more advanced things like using React. Long story short, I just wanted to show you, don't be disheartened if you go and check out forms yourself and see some attributes absent. The underlying concepts we've learned in this video still hold true, just the implementation is slightly different when using a front-end framework. So let's summarize this chapter and start to build out the summary card for this topic, forms. We looked at the form tags, which act as a wrapper for different form elements. The form element had two important attributes. The first was the action attribute, which specifies the location on the server where the data will be sent for processing. It's the where, like the history shelf in the library. The second attribute we saw was the method attribute, which determines the HTTP method used for handling the form data. It is the how we interact with the server. Like in the library, we were borrowing a book, and in web development terms, we are getting data. The other example we looked at was donating a book, and in web development terms, posting data. That is, creating a new record on the database, like adding a new book to the shelf. I'll be writing in red on the side here, as we'll be seeing a lot of form elements. This is the form element. Now, I know this was a tricky one. We discussed some more complex concepts involved in interacting with servers, which may seem very confusing, as we have not even spoken about servers or databases yet. For now, if you can walk away from this video, just conceptually understanding the idea that from our forms, we send data to a specific place on a server, like different sections of a library, and we interact with our server in different ways, like borrowing or donating a book, then you're doing great. The details of how all this works we will cover later on. Let's now look at how we're going to use forms in our Quill project. We're going to be using a form on the Quill Create Journal page. This is another section of our web application. It's the form that will be used to create journal entries. As you can see, this form has different elements, like a title, journal type, and entry. But for now, we're just going to be adding in the form container element we have just learned about. So here I am in the index page in our Quill application. Inside the Quill working directory folder, I'm going to right-click and add a new file. I'm going to call this createjournal.html. Straight away, I'm going to grab my boilerplate code by hitting !enter, and I'm going to give it a save. We'll create the title here of Create Journal. Inside the body, I'm just going to add an H1 and add the text Create Journal, so it's clear what this page is for users. I'm then going to add our form element. I do this by just typing form and hitting enter. And you can see we automatically get the action attribute. And if you remember, this is the location on the server the data will be sent. I'm just going to put for now /API/v1/journals. Again, this won't mean much to you right now, but just remember it's the location on the server the data will be sent, just like the history shelf in the library. I'm then going to come and add our method attribute. Now, because this is a journal creation page, we're sending our journal data to the server, which then sends it to the database to create a new record. It's like donating a book. So all I'm going to type here is post. I'm then going to hit enter and put a comment here by hitting Command / on my Mac or Control / on a Windows machine. And I'm just going to say add form elements here, which we will be doing in the next few chapters. Let's check out this page in the browser. Now, we're not actually going to see much. We can see our heading here, Create Journal, but nothing appears below for a form. That's because the form element is just a container. There's nothing to actually display on the page. Once we add in our elements, we will start seeing things appear here. We can check it's definitely there by going right-click Inspect. And you can see inside the body, we do have our form element. There's just nothing rendering on the page yet. Next, we'll look at how to gather user information through different types of form inputs. We'll be discussing different form elements, input types, the input tag, and form submission with inputs. We're going to start this chapter by looking at different form elements. There are three main HTML elements that allow users to enter or select data in a form. The first is inputs, like a text input for a name. There are a lot of these which we will be looking at in this chapter. The second is text area, where users can enter large chunks of text. And the third is a drop-down, where users can select from a predefined list, like the currency they want to pay for an airline ticket. Forms will often contain a mix of these elements. Looking at the Asana form we looked at earlier, in purple we can see form inputs. First name and last name are text inputs, the company email is an email input, and the phone number is a tel input. We'll talk more about these soon. Just note for now that these are actually different kinds of inputs. In green over here, we have two drop-downs, one for country and one for company size. And here in blue, we have a text area. This form uses all three types of form elements, inputs, drop-downs, and text area. But not every form will use them all. I chose this specific form as an example because it has all three, so it's nice to teach with. So let's now look at the different input types. The first category of input types are textual. They include things like a regular text input, a password input, an email input, a date input, a tel input, and a number input. Now, you may be asking yourself, what is the actual difference between some of these? Like, say, the text and email. They both just look like different text or user inputs. Let's take a look at the Unsplash registration page we saw in the previous chapter. So the first difference is how the text appears. For example, over here is just regular text for a first name, like Daniel. Whereas for a password field, I'm going to enter text, but you can see we get these solid fill circles appearing instead of the plain text. So that's the first difference, appearance. The second difference is something called validation, which we'll discuss later on in this topic. For now, to show you how this works, if I just enter regular text in the email field, like Daniel, instead of something like daniel@gmail.com, which it is expecting, if I hit join, you'll see we get this error message saying please include an @ symbol in the email address. So this text input email has some things happening behind the scene to know to expect the @ symbol for an email. This wouldn't happen for first name, it's just a regular text input. Another input type is called binary. There are two examples of a binary input, a checkbox and a radio button. We'll be looking at the checkbox and radio button later on in this topic. Then we have a file input, which allows users to upload a file like a passport photo when applying for a new bank. And then there are a whole bunch of miscellaneous inputs. Things like a range, where there is a slider for users to select different values. You might see this on something like a mortgage calculator to select different interest rates. We also have something like a color picker, which allows users to select a specific color and could be used to pick the background color of a web page, like a build-it-yourself, drag-and-drop wedding invitation website. Now, text inputs will be the focus of this chapter, and they are the most commonly used input type, and we will be using them throughout our Quill project. As I mentioned before, we'll be looking at binary types a bit later, but we won't be looking at file input and miscellaneous, as they are not as commonly used. And for now, it's better to focus on the important ones. This is also a good time to introduce you to a resource that is the golden standard for HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. It's called MDN Docs. It's kind of like the Encyclopedia Britannica, dedicated to HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and is the most trusted resource online. You can see if I hover over reference, we have HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and a few other things. If you want clarification on a topic, I suggest you search in Google the topic name followed by MDN. For example, I'm going to search HTML form inputs MDN. And this page will give me everything I need to know about the HTML form input. Something useful here is you can see all the different input types. And you can even play around with them, like the range input, or entering a password to see what happens. Now, I don't typically use the navigation when I'm looking at MDN Docs. As I said before, I'll pop into Google the topic I'm interested in and then just write MDN after. So we can see that there are a lot of input types, and forms will often use a mix of them. Back on the Asana page, we can see we have two text inputs here for first name, last name, an email input here, and a tel input here for a phone number. We also have a checkbox over here, which is still an input, but as we saw before, it's a binary type of input, as opposed to a text input like the fields above. And we will be looking at this later in this topic. So let's now take a look at the input tag. The input tag is a self-closing tag and looks like this. The input tag has important attributes. The first is the type attribute, and it specifies the type of input. This attribute is always required, so you have to have it. We've already seen the names of these values, but here are some examples of how it would look written as an attribute. Type equals email, type equals password, and type equals date. And obviously you'd have the others like type equals tel, etc. The next attribute is the name attribute. This assigns an identifier for data collection. This attribute is required when sending data to a server, which is most of the time. So the purpose of the name attribute is to give the data you are inputting a name so that the server knows what this data relates to. For example, if I'm submitting a title for a journal entry, we could call this name equals journal entry. Other examples may include name equals email, or name equals user password, and even name equals name, for say the name of a user. You have complete freedom to choose whatever value you want for the name attribute. Now at this point, I want to highlight something that can cause a lot of confusion when starting out. And that is the fact you can have the same value for type and name. For example, over here I have type equals email and name equals email. Let's look at type equals email first. This is just saying that the input type is an email. We need to enter an email address with the syntax like daniel@gmail.com. But we can also have a name equals email. This attribute is serving a very different purpose. It means that when daniel@gmail.com is submitted to the server will receive the email data as email equals daniel@gmail.com. So the type attribute is specifying what type of input this is, and the name attribute is used to give the data that will be inputted a name when it hits the server, so the server knows what we're talking about. To make things more simple in this section of the course, I am going to use name values that are always different to the type value, so I don't confuse you. So for example, I wouldn't call this name equals email. I'd call it something like name equals user email. Now, in reality, most developers wouldn't do this. They would just have this as type equals email and name equals email. But I want to keep these different for now to help distinguish these when you're starting out. Don't worry too much if this is still confusing you right now. We're going to look again at the library analogy so you can better visualize what I'm talking about. The final attribute we can have are other attributes. They're simply other attributes we can use, and you can use one or more of them. They're totally optional, so you don't have to use them. The example I have here is placeholder equals enter title. This will simply put the text enter title inside the form input. You can see this placeholder attribute value over here, where we have e.g. John, Smith, name@company.com, etc. More examples of other attributes include max length, which could be used to set a maximum journal title entry. The word required, which ensures the user enters a value in that form field before they submit. We'll look at this one a bit later when we discuss validation. And the word disabled, which prevents users from inputting. This is commonly used once a form has been submitted, and the data is in the process of being sent to the server. You would then use this to disable the form, so users can't change any details during the process of sending the data to the server. You'll notice that some other attributes have a value, like max length equals 10, while other attributes have no value, and this is totally fine. Let's go check out the different text form inputs on the Asana form. I'm going to right-click and go Inspect, and then I'm going to use the inspection tool to click on an input. This input is the type text. It's just a regular text input. You can see it's been given a name of first name, which is used to identify the data sent to the server. And there are also some other attributes like placeholder, e.g. equals John, and max length equals 255, so a name can't be more than 255 characters. Let's check out the company email input. You can see here the type is email, because this is an email input. You can also see the name is email. They've just capitalized the E. So if I entered for this field daniel@gmail.com, the server would receive data that would look like email equals daniel@gmail.com. You can see we have the placeholder attribute, as well as the max length attribute. Let's quickly look at the phone number attribute as well. You can see this is a type of tel, which is used for a telephone. We've got the name attribute, and again, two optional attributes, placeholder and max length. Don't worry about the other attributes inside each input, they're not important for now. So let's head back to our form submission library analogy to visualize how this all works. We've seen that forms need to know where to and how to send data. Just a quick reminder of the library analogy. We want to borrow a book, so we ask the librarian for a book. The librarian looks for the book on the shelf, and if the book is present, takes it and gives it to us. The interaction of borrowing the book is the how. In web development terms, it is the method. And because we are borrowing a book, it is a get method. The location of the book on the shelf is the where. In this case, it's on the history shelf. And in web development terms, it is the action, which is the location on the server. And because this is a history book, the action attribute would be something like action equals /history. Now, we've just spoken about HTML form inputs. So the other variable that we need to add into this analogy is the data part. In the library analogy, this is about what we are asking for. In this case, it is a book. Bringing this back to HTML form inputs, this can be described as type equals book. And we'd also be asking the librarian the name of the book we want. So this would be something like name equals mouse, which is a history book. In web development terms, the type would be an input type like type equals email, and name would be something like name equals user email. The library and a web application are conceptually working the same way. Both the book in the library and data in an HTML form both have a type and name, and both requests are eventually being fulfilled somewhere. In the library, a book is retrieved from a bookshelf, and in web development, data is retrieved from a database. Let's now look at the other case. The case when we donate a book as opposed to borrow it. Let's say we're going to donate the same book we requested in the previous video. So this is type equals book and name equals mouse. So the what hasn't changed. The where also hasn't changed because this book will eventually be added to a history shelf. What has changed is the how, which is now method equals post. We are giving the librarian a book and it is added on the shelf, just like a new record being created in a database. Let's now go back to the borrowing case. So we are back at method equals get. But now I want to change the what. In this case, we'll be asking to borrow a movie instead of a book. So the type now is movie, not book. And let's say we're looking for the movie called Unbroken, which is another history movie. So in this case, the name will be Unbroken. Now movie is just acting like another type, like type equals email or type equals password. But the point of showing you this is that just like you can ask to borrow a book or movie, so too in web development, you could ask to see different data, like a list of email addresses or a list of telephone numbers. The final case we will look at is when we want to now donate the movie instead of borrow it. The what is the same as before. It's still a movie called Unbroken. The how has now changed though. It's now method equals post. We are giving the librarian the movie called Unbroken, and the librarian will add it to the shelf like a new record being created in a database. Hopefully this library analogy is able to help you conceptually understand how form attributes of method and action work together with the input attributes of type and name. So a form knows what kind of data it is sending, how it is sending it, and where it is sending it. Later on in this topic, we'll be spending an entire chapter just talking about form submission and going into more detail, so don't worry too much about it right now. So in this chapter, we learned about the input tag. We saw that there were several attributes. We saw that there was the type attribute. The value of the type attribute would be something like text, email, password, etc., and defines what type of input this is. Next was the name attribute, which gives the submitted data a name, so when it arrives on the server knows what this data relates to. We can call this whatever we want, like title for a journal title. And the last attribute we saw are other attributes, like placeholder, max length, etc. And these are all totally optional, and you can use one or more of them. All of this makes up the input element. Let's now go and add inputs on the Quill Create Journal page. We will be adding a single text input for the title of the journal. So I am back in the Create Journal HTML page, I'm going to delete this comment and go grab an input tag by typing input and hitting enter. You'll see it automatically gives me a type attribute with the default value text. Now, luckily for us, this is a text input, so we can leave it as it is. But if it were another input like an email, we would just change it over here. Just a reminder, the type input is defining the input type. In this case, just a plain text input. The next attribute we're going to give our input is the name attribute. Because this is a journal title, I'm just going to give it the name of title. And again, just to remind you what this is doing, when a user eventually enters a title in the form field, something like I had a great day, that will be submitted to the server. But it will be submitted to the server as title equals I had a great day. This value is serving as an identifier for the value the user will eventually enter, so that when it hits the server knows what this data relates to. And again, you can call this whatever you want. I'm also going to give it another attribute, which is totally optional. I'm going to give it the placeholder attribute, and I'm going to type enter title. Let's go check this out in the browser. So you can see we now have an input type here. Enter title is the placeholder, and it is a text type. So it's expecting just plain text like, I had a great day. Moving on, we'll explore how to enhance accessibility and usability by using form labels. We'll be discussing the purpose of form labels and the label tag. So what are form labels? Labels improve accessibility and usability of forms. Looking back at the Unsplash registration form, we can see labels here above each input. These labels behind the scenes are also linked to their respective inputs. For example, when I click the word email here, you'll see that it moves my cursor to the email field to allow me to start typing in an email. And this is the case for all of these labels. If I click password over here, I'm immediately taken to that input field and I can start typing away. So behind the scenes, these labels are connected to their respective input. Now you may be thinking, who cares about labels? They just seem like extra work. I could just use a placeholder attribute with the value of first name instead of using a label. There are 3 good reasons why you should always use labels. The first is that they are generally easier to read. The second is that they are needed for screen readers, so it makes your code more accessible for those who have visual impairments. And because the label and respective input are connected behind the scenes, it makes the usability much easier on smaller devices like a mobile, where clicking on a label would take you straight to the input box. Let's now take a look at the label tag. I'm first going to go grab the input from our Quill application for the journal title. As we've seen, the label we're going to add is somehow connected to this input. And to do that in HTML, we first need to add an ID attribute to the input. As a reminder, the ID attribute, which we've looked at already, identifies an element and must be a unique value. I've given this input an ID value of main title, but you can call it whatever you like. It is also common for the ID attribute to be the first attribute, so that's why I've put it at the start. We can now add the label tags, which is made up of an opening tag and closing tag, wrapping the label text, in this case, journal title. To connect this label element with the journal title input, we need to add a new attribute called the for attribute. The for attribute is specifically used in HTML form labels, so you're not really going to see it anywhere else. The value of the for attribute has to be the exact same of the value of the ID attribute in the input, so we have to call it main title. So both the for and ID have the same value of main title. Doing this now connects the label to the input. I'd also like to highlight something which can cause confusion when it comes to deciding the values for ID and for attributes. We could have given the ID a value of title, and the for attribute a value of title as well. These values are the same, so our label would still be connected to the input. What I want you to take note of now is that the name attribute also has a value of title. When you get more comfortable with HTML, you'll likely name your attributes like this. And it is totally fine because the ID and for attribute and name attribute are doing totally different things. The ID attribute of title is just being used to link to the for attribute of title in the label. It's just connecting our input and label. On the other hand, the name attribute with the value of title is used when sending data to the server, so that the server knows that this data we are receiving is the title of a journal. So because they're doing totally different things, you can actually label them the same. And as I mentioned, doing this is actually fairly common, reusing a succinct value like title for the ID and for attribute as well as the name attribute. In fact, there are some circumstances where all your values would be the same. I'm going to demonstrate this by creating an email input. I'm going to grab the input. I'm going to change the type to email, which identifies this input type as an email. I'm then going to make the name email. Again, this is the identifier that is sent to the server, so that when the user inputs an email like daniel@gmail.com, the server receives email equals daniel@gmail.com. I'm then going to add an ID with the value email, which is used to identify the input element itself and helps us connect to a label. I'm then going to go grab the label element. I'm going to call this email. And for the for value, I'm going to call it email. By having the for and ID value the same, this connects the label to the input. So you can see I've used the email value for every single attribute. When starting out, it can be really confusing to know what all these values relate to. So I will be using different values for different attributes, so it is very clear how they relate to one another. So I'm going to remove the ID and for attribute and replace them with what we had before, main title. So in this chapter, we learned about the label element, which was made up of a label opening and closing tag, wrapping the label text. The label text had the for attribute, which was used to connect to the respective input. To make this work, the input needed an ID attribute with the same value. In this case, main title. Doing this connects the label and input elements. Now looking at the form overall, we've added in a label element. Now it is common to have repeating units of labels and inputs. So this is a block as part of the overall form. And we will now be adding more of these blocks as we move through this topic. Let's now go and add labels on our Quill Create Journal page. There are 3 labels we're going to be adding. One for the journal title, one for the journal type, and one for the journal entry. At this stage, we only have a text input type for the journal entry. So let's just go and add a label there in VS Code. So I'm back on our createjournal.html file. The first thing I'm going to go do is add an ID to this input. I'm going to give it the value of main-title. I'm then going to pop above this and get a label tag by typing label and hitting enter. Now the for attribute value needs to be the same as the ID attribute value. So this is main title. And we'll call the label journal title. Let's go check this out in the browser. So you can see that our label now appears next to the input. And if I click journal title, it highlights the input and allows me to start typing straight away. Now you'll notice that this label appears on the left of the input, not above. This behavior we will be discussing towards the end of the HTML section, so don't worry so much about it now. It is normal for this to happen. Now we'll dive into creating larger input fields for user text with the help of text area. We'll be discussing different form elements, what is a text area, and the text area tag. So just a reminder on the different form elements. There are 3 main HTML elements that allow users to enter or select data in a form. We have inputs, which we saw in the previous chapter, and if you remember, there were a lot of these. The second is dropdowns, which we will look at in the next chapter. And then there is a text area, which we will be looking at now. So what is a text area? It is an element used for multi-line text input, used for comments and longer messages. When I say input, I do not mean an HTML input type like text, email, password, etc. The text area is its own special kind of text input that does not belong to the input element. Here is an example of a text area on the Asana form. You can see that users can enter a longer description of what they would like to discuss with the sales team. Let's now take a look at the text area tag. The text area has an opening tag and a closing tag. Let's now take a look at all the attributes. We'll first add an ID attribute, as we're going to need that for a label. I'm going to be building the text area for the journal entry on our Quill application. So I'm going to give this an ID with the value of journal